Well, let's go ahead and get started then. It's my pleasure to introduce the first session to friends and colleagues. Ofelia, Dr. Schepers is from Metropolitan State University, my home institution. Welcome, Ofelia. And we had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Rodriguez earlier today with the earlier session. And as you know, he's the director of the Bueno Center. Their session today, with a nice turnout, that's nice to see, y'all, is called I'm Not Sure About Latinx, Reflections and Tools to Facilitate Conversations for Gender Inclusive Language. Fascinating topic. I'm looking forward to learning from you. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Sounds good. I'm sharing my screen. Can everybody see that? Sorry, Ofelia, can you thumbs up me if you can see it?
No, I'm not. No? All I see is your name right now.
Okay, let me try that again.
Take two.
Let's see. Sorry, I had it queued up, but I wanted to see the gallery of the attendees, so I didn't want to take up everyone's screen. What about now?
It says you're sharing. Oh, there it is. There it goes.
Okay, great. So yeah, we'll get started, especially in the interest of time. We've only got 75 minutes with you, and I think they'll go pretty quickly. But we just wanted to welcome everyone for joining us. We're really glad about our turnout as well. We'll introduce ourselves here in a couple of minutes, but again, I'm Dr. Jesus Rodriguez, and this is my colleague and friend, Dr. Ofelia Schepers, and we are excited to engage in this important conversation with each of you. With so many sessions that are happening as we speak, we truly appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us this morning. The intent of the session, as you know, is to leave more fully aware of how our biases impact and can further marginalize the LGBTQIA+ Latinx community. We also hope that this session gives you some tools to continue to advocate for students and allow for students to explore their own identities within your shared spaces. We'll have some anecdotes, a little bit of data, and some resources for you, but our intent is to create a space where we are all contributing to this important conversation. And before we go too much further, we also would like to issue a couple of quick disclaimers. In just a minute, as I mentioned, Dr. Schepers will introduce herself and then share some testimonial with you all, and I'll do the same afterward. But though everything we're sharing with you today is supported by research, experiences, experts, etc., we ourselves are not experts per se in queer inclusivity, queer theory, nor queer pedagogies, but we do both identify as LGBTQIA+ allies. And our session today is grounded in advocacy for our Latinx LGBTQIA+ community. This session is not intended to convince you about how you personally choose to identify. That is completely up to you. It is, however, designed to encourage you to use inclusive language and create spaces in your community for the exploration of identity. So with that in mind, we're excited to begin our session with you, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Schepers.
Thank you, Jesus. So we're going to start really with some testimonials about our own coming into understandings of our identities, and really more than an ally to the LGBTQIA community. I hope such like Dr. Medina was talking about, really getting into that co-conspirator face, right? And so I identify as she, her, hers. Those are my pronouns in ella. And I often identify as a Mexicana, as that is my nationality. And as we'll cover later on in our presentation, when in Latin American countries, it's really typical to identify by nationality first. So really Latinidad came for me as being and becoming a US citizen and really finding that identity within. And so when really I first delved into gender identity, it was often how gender was imposed on me rather than my own creation of my gender identity and my own perception of it. It was always imposed, right? And it was imposed highly in family structures and school structures. And so my first experience really of questioning it was in elementary school, right? So I just always remember wondering that when they would call on boys and girls, even in English, right? There's this gendered notion, but when I was in schools that were Spanish speaking as well, you would hear the niños y niñas, but it was rarely that, right? Because Spanish is gendered, you would hear niños for all of us, right? Like this collective group. And it really bothered me, right? That I wasn't included in this grand scope of niños. And so I remember thinking like, it's not fair. It's not, I don't feel like a part of this collective group. And so this notion for me actually later expanded, wondering why we couldn't refer to a group of gendered mixed groups as niños, niñas, or boys and girls, right? So I then went into the binary, right? So I elevated and examined this patriarchal notion that elevates men and wanted to, at the expense of women, and instead wanted to elevate women, right? So why can't we say niñas when there's a group of boys and girls? And yet, that shift continued, that journey continued, that while it was pushing against patriarchal notions to think of niños y niñas, I also had to grow and think through and consider how to push against the binary in general. And so while elevating women in these spaces was important, what I really wanted, truly wanted, was to eliminate the exclusionary practice itself. And so for me, this became easy in navigating spaces when I wasn't sure of people's pronouns or mixed groups to really thinking about Latinx. It just, it made sense for me. And so it's a journey. It has been a journey, and it's been a journey in self-reflection for myself of how my Latinidad has really, really shown up. But yeah, so that's a little bit of my testimonio on this.
My pronouns are él, he, him, his. Because I am cis hetero, I am rarely, if ever, misgendered. Cis hetero means I am heterosexual and I identify with the gender I was assigned at birth. This is important because that's a privilege that I have, that even if I don't announce my pronouns, it is highly unlikely that I will be misgendered. And that isn't true for everyone. And just yesterday evening, one of my dear friends and colleagues posted this reflection on social media, which broke my heart. They said, my pronouns are they, them. These have been my pronouns, but I have allowed the world to use he and him for the convenience of not having to explain myself and constantly correct people. Even though I announce my pronouns in those perfunctory pronoun intro activities, colleagues and students continue to misgender me. This happens to many of us who are gender nonconforming. So these activities end up being performative and reify binaristic paradigms. Dr. Schepers will talk about pronouns a little bit more here in a bit. But as I mentioned in our introduction, we both identify as allies and as co-conspirators. And we need to do introspective work to determine what it means to be an effective ally or a good co-conspirator to create truly inclusive communities. I just shared an anecdote with you from last night, but Dr. Schepers may recall that I literally shared a very similar anecdote with her like a week ago from a different friend and colleague who I observed to be misgendered in a faculty meeting. And shamefully, I didn't say anything. In fact, no one did. I think there's this fear of making someone uncomfortable at the expense of someone else's comfort. And in my opinion, that's not an effective allyship or co-conspirator practice. In terms of how I identify, I recently shared a reflection on my journey with my own identity on Medium, which is an open digital publishing platform. And I've included a link to that reflection in our resources that we'll give to you later. But I'll spare you all of the details for now and just try to summarize that in that reflection. I talk about my own experiences with being born in Denver, Colorado, here in the United States, to parents from Miguelausa, Zacatecas, Mexico. I also talk about my own experiences with Mexican, American, Chicano, Hispanic, Latino, Indigenous, or Brown, Mestizo, and Latinx. I personally, as I mentioned at the welcome remarks, I personally identify as Indigenous or Brown first, but I am often identified as Latino. For me, my complex relationship with Latinidad is rooted in that it perpetuates the erasure of my Indigenous identity. So when considering the use of Latinx, I embrace the inclusive X. My issue is not with the X, my issue is more with the Latin. But in that reflection, you'll also learn that virtually everything I learned about my race, ethnicity, language, history, overall identity, I learned outside of school. And in my opinion, that's not okay. And this is actually the reality for most kids in schools. I want to share another quick anecdote with you before I turn it back over to Dr. Schepers, and that's that I didn't always show up as a strong ally. In fact, because of prevalent toxic masculinity culture, which is something we'll discuss a little bit later, while I was growing up, I've been harmful to myself and to others, particularly by not always leveraging my privilege and allyship. Right after I graduated from high school, I began to work with seniors in an AVID program at a high school. And I tutored a brilliant student who was barely older than I was at the time, who wrote this beautiful speech about why it is so problematic for kids to use the expression "that's gay" to describe something that was undesirable to them. The student came out as gay while delivering the speech, and it impacted me significantly. It quickly made me realize that I had heard people use that expression countless times in my life, and I had never articulated to them that it was problematic. In fact, I wish that I could say that I had never used that expression before that day myself. I'm sharing that with you because I think vulnerability is important. If you want any kind of change to happen, there is a difference, in my opinion, between being homophobic, not homophobic, and anti-homophobic, similar to the way that Dr. Kendi describes racism. Homophobia is the irrational fear of, aversion to, or discrimination against homosexuality or gay people. Saying things like "that's gay" is homophobic. Not homophobic is a claim that signifies neutrality. It is to say, I'm not personally homophobic, but neither am I aggressively against it. So not saying anything when you hear someone misgender a colleague or student could be considered not homophobic, for example. And then anti-homophobia is supporting anti-homophobic policy or practice through actions or ideas. In other words, it is calling out the problematic use of homophobic expressions, including misgendering folks, but also creating spaces that eradicate their use completely. Again, this session is not intended to convince you to identify in any particular way, but rather to leave more fully aware of how our own biases can impact and further marginalize LGBTQIA+ Latinx communities. Further, we hope that this session gives you the tools to continue to advocate for students and facilitate opportunities for them to explore their own identities.
So in the Whova app, if you're in that, we have put a poll. So there's the chat section in that, and then there's a poll. And the poll is really having you think about what's your familiarity with Latinx. I've heard of Latinx and I use it. I've heard of Latinx and I don't use it, or I haven't heard of Latinx. So if you could go on to that app and check out the poll and respond, that would be incredibly helpful. And as that happens, I also want to pause and really reflect and think about what does it mean to update signatures and screen names? So I know that Dr. Medina really talked about this, right? It's this small sense of this small thing that you can do when being virtual that is a really inclusive practice. And so I think as you take the poll, I want you to also pause and think about in your Zoom, or if you're in Whova, checking out the rename and adding and identifying your pronouns. And so we'll pause for a second and think through, have you go through that practice, and then we'll talk a little bit about what does it mean for you to update that, and for us as a collective to do it as well. So I'm going to mute for a second. And I see somebody saying that I have my pronouns on Zoom, but they don't always show up. Absolutely. I have been navigating this as well, right? Switching from app to app, and sometimes having to redo it if it doesn't connect to my own Zoom. And just a quick anecdote. My spouse, my husband, he was on a Zoom call, and he doesn't have a Zoom account. So it always just takes him to a regular, whatever Zoom goes to it. And so we clicked around and found how he could quickly do it. And a few days later, he meets with clients often. One of his clients thanked him for posting that, said that it's really uncommon in the accounting world to see that. And he also added his pronouns to his signature in his emails, which was really easy, right? So with that, he noticed and shared with me that a few of the people in his office also update that as well. So sometimes it's creating that space, even if it's just modeling it by doing it yourself, right? You're opening up the space and saying it's okay to do this, especially for him, right? For teachers, but for him being the head of his department, really opened up that space. Yeah, and one final thing on this one that I'd want to share is that there are, I think one of the things that we have, I'm sorry, I'm reading the chat and seeing some comments on there, but we'll get to those. One of the things I do want to share about pronoun usage on your Zoom is that it is, I am in groups and see people who are allies, and I know they're allies, and it's rare to see pronouns, right? So there's only ever a handful, and sometimes it's being able to navigate the space to get that and have that time to pause and be able to do that. Thanks. So we're going to get a little bit into, oh, did we lose it?
I'm switching out just to be safe and playing the videos outside of the deck.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to play them, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'm getting them up right now. Do you see the Obama one?
Yes.
Okay, good. Still?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. But I also detest the sort of bashing and vilifying of gays and lesbians because I think it's unduly divisive. It's unnecessary. Most gays and lesbians are simply seeking basic recognition of their rights. We've got to make sure that everybody is equal under the law. And the civil unions that I proposed would be equivalent in terms of making sure that all the rights that are conferred by the state are equal for same-sex couples as well as for heterosexual couples. Now, with respect to marriage, it's my belief that it's up to the individual denominations to make a decision as to whether they want to recognize marriage or not. With respect to gay marriage, I do not support gay marriage, but I support a very strong version of civil unions where I think the state has to recognize the same rights and responsibilities for gay people, same-sex couples, as they do for anybody else. Because the state is not a religious institution, and I believe in equal protection under the law. And so making sure that, the right to transfer property, hospital visitation, non-discrimination, all those principles apply to same-sex couples, I think is important.
Define marriage.
I believe that marriage is the union between a man and a woman.
Would you support a constitutional amendment with that definition?
No, I would not. I am not somebody who promotes same-sex marriage, but I do believe in civil unions. I do believe that we should not, that for gay partners to want to visit each other in a hospital, for the state to say, you know what, that's all right. I don't think in any way inhibits my core beliefs about what marriage are. I believe that gay couples deserve the same legal rights as every other couple in this country. You should never have to look over your shoulder to be gay in the United States of America. I issued an order so that any hospital in America that accepts Medicare or Medicaid, and that means just about every hospital, has to treat gay partners just as they do straight partners, because nobody should have to produce a legal contract to hold the hand of the person that they love.
We have one more quick video. Let me switch screens here, but what we're trying to highlight here, as you may have picked up on, is President Barack Obama's evolution on gay marriage specifically over the years. So we'll play this really quickly, which was the announcement after the gay marriage ruling a few years ago.
This morning, the Supreme Court recognized that the Constitution guarantees marriage equality. In doing so, they've reaffirmed that all Americans are entitled to the equal protection of the law. That all people should be treated equally, regardless of who they are or who they love. This decision will end the patchwork system we currently have. It will end the uncertainty hundreds of thousands of same-sex couples face from not knowing whether their marriage, legitimate in the eyes of one state, will remain if they decide to move or even visit another. This ruling will strengthen all of our communities by offering to all loving same-sex couples the dignity of marriage across this great land. In my second inaugural address, I said that if we are truly created equal, then surely the love we commit to one another must be equal as well. It is gratifying to see that principle enshrined into law by this decision. This ruling is a victory for Jim Ofelia and the other plaintiffs in the case. It's a victory for gay and lesbian couples who have fought so long for their basic civil rights. It's a victory for their children, whose families will now be recognized as equal to any other. It's a victory for the allies and friends and supporters who spent years, even decades, working and praying for change to come. And this ruling is a victory for America. This decision affirms what millions of Americans already believe in their hearts. When all Americans are treated as equal, we are all more free. My administration has been guided by that idea. It's why we stopped defending the so-called Defense of Marriage Act, and why we were pleased when the court finally struck down a central provision of that discriminatory law. It's why we ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell. From extending full marital benefits to federal employees and their spouses, to expanding hospital visitation rights for LGBT patients and their loved ones, we've made real progress in advancing equality for LGBT Americans in ways that were unimaginable not too long ago. I know change for many of our LGBT brothers and sisters must have seemed so slow for so long. But compared to so many other issues, America's shift has been so quick. I know that Americans of goodwill continue to hold a wide range of views on this issue. Opposition in some cases has been based on sincere and deeply held beliefs. All of us who welcome today's news should be mindful of that fact.
Thank you for playing those, Jesus. I wanted to, it was definitely for the intention of looking at this, this shift in time. And as Sally in the chat said, being a lifelong learner means we will and should change our ideas about the world based on what we learn. And absolutely right, thinking through your journey, and what we want to do is hold a little bit of space to think through your journey about your gender identity and your understandings about it. And before we do that and share a little bit, I do want to respond to a few things that came up in the chat kind of regarding identity and understanding of this. In that is that using your pronouns and identifying your pronouns normalizes that it's not a binary and it's not an assumption. And so the intention isn't that you don't know your pronouns, it's that you're normalizing the fact that there isn't, not everyone identifies he or she, or not everyone identifies or really trying to avoid the traumatization that happens from being misgendered. And so if you're somebody that's constantly misgendered, having a space where people are normalizing the use of genders, then that doesn't happen. And then even in Zoom, right? Zoom, when we put our pronouns, it's a passive action. I recently had a Zoom meeting where someone verbally introduced themselves to us and stated their pronouns aloud. And so I think that this is very typical and can be done in person as well. And so absolutely. So we'll be, Jesus will be talking about our journey. And so if you all want to share about your own journey on gender identity, we'll have a few minutes to do that. I don't think very, very long, but.
And or other identities, whether that's, white or cis hetero or etc. Our question.
I'd like to just share briefly, Jesus, because it really resonated with me. Similar backgrounds, and the Latino macho and the whole kind of homophobic sense that was pretty rampant, really, in my household and in my community. Yes, even though the fact that years later as a younger adult, I came to realize, well, gee, my aunt was a lesbian, and we still had these, all the terms, man. I don't want to have to say them, but those are real common, the kind of Spanish slurs. And yeah, that was something that as a young man, I think it sounds like similar to maybe what you went through, coming to grips with that whole and owning that, wow, that was a really negative part of my identity that I had to come to grips with and grow through. So thank you for sharing that. It really resonated with me.
So this is Stella. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'll wait. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, as a member of the LGBTQ community for a long time, came out when I was 19. Prior to that, I was often referred to as a boy, sir, him, or also probably the most interesting, even as an adult, is going into the female bathroom, even though I assume that I look like a female going into the bathroom. My hair sometimes does not fit the common mold of what a female hair should look like. And so I sometimes still get looks of like, am I supposed to be in this bathroom or not? And sometimes it's hard, but I think probably one of the biggest struggles that I've had being openly gay is being a teacher and then a principal. There is a belief that at least as I was growing up, like don't share that you're a lesbian because families may view you as somebody they don't want leading their buildings. And so I made a strong commitment when I came to Emory Elementary in Jefferson County as a dual language principal, is I am open with my families. They know and understand my course and what I'm here to help their students with. And so even as I had a conversation just recently with a teacher is sitting down with our older students and letting them know that I'm here as a member of the community, is that if they're questioning or having a hard time of feeling as though they are being bullied, they can come to me and I will sit down with their peers and say, you know, I am this person that you're negatively talking about. So it's been a big transition and a journey from being a principal who didn't want to share with the community that I was a lesbian, that I have a child, you know, by with a gay man. What is that like? So my son has 3 parents. And so it's just been a journey, and I appreciate this session specifically because it matters to my students that I'm able to have conversations with them, and also moms who come to me worried that their daughters are going to be lesbians, and what does that mean, and how do they support them? So thank you for having this session. It matters.
Thank you so much for sharing.
So this is Estella. I suppose that.
Hey, Estela, you just muted yourself.
Sorry. Okay. Is that in the last 5 years as a high school teacher, I learned I needed to get woke about how other people identify themselves. So there were honestly the first I knew of the changing pronouns was like 5 years ago, and the students were telling me, Miss, you need to use they and them or he or her based on how they identify themselves. So I was schooled by the high school students and my son and his friends about the whole gamut. And so right now, my identity, I'm good. I'm wanting to be genuine about how I address people. And being more aware of the privilege I have with my pronoun that I never considered. So I want to do it right. And so, yeah, I have made mistakes in the past that I'm not proud of. So I'm here to try to make it better. So thank you for the session.
Thank you all for sharing some of those. Truly enriches the conversation that we're hoping to have with you all. I'm gonna see if I can move us on to our next slide here and continue our conversation so we don't run out of time before 10:30.
So I saw this in the chat, and but I wanted to talk a little bit in this piece about Latino, right? So as we think about getting to Latinx, we really have to root in the societal factors of what it even means to be Latino, right? The term Hispanic is often used interchangeably with the term Latino, and more actually less now as we kind of move on. But it was introduced in the 1970s for the census. And it came from civil rights activists wanting to be accounted for, right? And so the term Latino, on the other hand, is Spanish language term that has increased in usage since the introduction of the term Hispanics. You don't have to use this, but it refers to folks from Latin American countries. And some Latinos, Hispanics feel strongly about which term they prefer. And somebody mentioned in the chat that they were, somebody was offended by the term Latinx, right? And so we'll kind of dig into the root of that. But first, really understanding that some Latinos and Hispanics feel strongly about which term they prefer. Some reject both terms and insist they should be known by their national origin. And then still others use all terms and vary their usage depending on the context. So those who prefer Latino argue that the term preserves the flavor of national origin and political relationships with the US and Latin America. For example, they also believe that it's, can be racially inclusive because Hispanic is, framed on the Spanish. And so the term itself, right, using Latino and Latina hasn't always been the most used and well-known term. So in understanding that has also gone through language shifts really helps us situate Latinx and how it's situated in the US. So yeah.
And then I did see the question too of the X, and this will just be very quick, but we use this map because Latia and was spoken Latinos to people of the languages that is a descendant of that. So that includes Spanish, French, that includes Italian, that includes Portuguese. So Brazil and Haiti, for example, included in that Latinidad profile. The X is a non-gender binary specifically. We'll talk a little bit more about it here in a little bit, but another one. And just to intro it really quickly, the video is by a person named Kat Lasso, who works for Me Too, which is a Latinx digital platform. She has did this video called "What's with the X and Latinx?" It received like 150,000 views and a ton of comments, but most of the comments were really negative and calling for her to be fired. They included hateful attacks, like calling her a beaner, threatening her with rape, and the most popular comments were people who opposed the video. So without further ado, I'm gonna play this video for you all. It's only three, where did it go? It's only 3 minutes long. And then we'll talk a little bit about it right afterwards. So let me cue that up for you all. All right, can you all see where it says, David, yo, dude, check out this article? Okay.
Yo, dude, check out this article. 10 annoying things all Latinx do. What the heck is Latinx? It's the gender inclusive alternative to Latino and Latina. Isn't that what Latinos for? Why they gotta go and ruin the Spanish language for? So complicated to say.
Whoa. The only thing that's complicated around here is that outfit. This is the cat call, and I'm calling this shit out. 2 main reasons why Latinx is used. 1, to dismantle the patriarchy. The Spanish language is gendered. Almost all of our words are male or female, like amigas or amigos, but we use the male term as the universal term for everyone. So for example, if there's a room full of 3 women, we'd say, I'm with mis amigas. But the minute one man enters, it becomes, I'm with mis amigos. The X in Latinx is an effort of pushing against the masculine term dictating our language. Using terms like policeman or mankind subconsciously tell women and girls that they aren't included, limiting the possibilities they create for themselves or telling them that they're inferior to men. So Latinx replacing the universal Latino is like using police officer instead of policeman, or saying Times Person of the Year instead of Man of the Year. Although not everyone's down for gender inclusive terms.
Who'd rather have it the Man of the Year? The women are also.
Number 2, to break down the gender binary. We've learned growing up that there are 2 genders, men and women. But what if you don't fit in either, or you fit both?
Like me. Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a transgender non-conforming person, and I identify as Latinx. Latina and Latina don't fit me. I float somewhere in the middle, so I use they and them pronouns instead of he or she. My grandmother raised her children to not care about gender or allow gender to limit us. There was no such thing as girls do this or boys do that. I get that not everyone was raised like that, so this can be really confusing and complicated. And I understand your discomfort because even I had trouble switching my own pronouns. Using Latinx may feel strange at first, but as a trans and gender non-conforming person, it makes me feel accepted and acknowledged.
All right, but it's still not a real word. Latinx is brewed in the Spanish language.
Is there really integrity in a language for some people by colonizers? Besides, today's Spanish isn't the Castilian Spanish that was spoken years ago. It's a mixture of Arabic, Indigenous, and West African words. Language is ever evolving, but yet you mad at just one word, huh?
All right, but do I have to refer to myself as Latinx?
No, of course not. The objective is to be inclusive, and including more people doesn't erase your identity. Your gender is important to you the same way that it's important to trans and gender non-conforming people. I get it, we added another term to the sancocho that is us, and it complicates stuff a bit. But hey, we're complex people, and addressing those complications is a good thing.
Complicated and beautiful, just like my man's outfit.
Any of you hungry? I can go for some sancocho right now.
Yeah, I'm hungry. Let me go.
All right, let me switch back to the deck here. Sorry.
And while you do that, I just want to address a question that was made about using Latinoa versus Latinx in writing. And I think with any writing, especially if it's academic writing, what you choose is really you have to justify that. So for me, I've even when we think about saying emergent bilinguals instead of English language learners, right? I've had to put a note on why I situate myself in using that language. And so that's what I would encourage in that case.
Agreed. So there were a few different things that they, Kat and her friends there. One was for masculinity, being trans, all of supremacy of the father in the clan or family, the legal dependence of wives and children, and the reckoning of descent and inheritance in the male line. Broadly, it's controlled by men of a disproportionately large share of power. Also, another definition is a society or institution organized according to the principles or practices of patriarchy. And so before we go too much further, we'll do this pretty quickly, again, in the interest of time, but we want to open up the folks to unmute themselves or throw some reactions in the chat to the patriarchy part of the video. I saw a few comments that my sound wasn't okay, but I'm not sure if you all heard me. I was just asking if folks could react to the patriarchy part of the video. You could do that by unmuting yourself, or you can drop a few quick comments in the chat.
Jesus, one thing I would respond to is I don't think as educators, we're all understanding of how that patriarchy has affected our students and our communities. Is we still don't have enough time or provided enough time. We have the time, but to actually unpack these things and these elements with teachers and students and families, that's what it makes me think of is as an educator, we're not provided the opportunities, and we have to make space for those opportunities and really unpack it with students. Because even as a fifth grader is speaking to his friends through the lens of his culture, which is through the Bible, they're not understanding why he is stating things that are upsetting to them, talking about gays and lesbians in a way, but he also doesn't have that context. And so sometimes we engage in conversations where we're pushing against what that student's family believes. And so we're balancing how to advocate and teach and learn at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. So it's absolutely, I think, complex, as Kat mentioned in the video, and as you underscored there in your reflection, Lisa. And we agree. And of course, I guess in the interest of time, I won't spend too much time on the examples, but there's a ton of gendered words in Spanish. And many of you are familiar with those as well. And so I want to just share with you a really quick story about my friends from Mexico who in that blog that I referenced earlier, I talk about this story of amiguequis. So in Spanish, you could say amiguequis, and some folks in Spanish say amigue, because it is hard to say amiguex in Spanish, similarly to in English that it's sometimes strange as well. But quick, long story short, my family is from a small town in Zacatecas called Miguel Ausa, and over 20 years ago, I spent a lot of time there. And before that, growing up, spending summers there, and I had a group of friends who they sort of congregated by gender. So there's a group of young men, and then there was a group of young women who would get together and in the plaza or La Alameda. And there was one young man who generally spent his time with the young women. And so when I was there, this is like 20 years ago, and this is a small town in Mexico, they taught me about words like amiguequis, mexicanequis, etc. They didn't identify themselves as Latinx or Latinx, because, and we'll talk about this here in a sec as well, but in Latin America, that's not the custom, right? So they identify first as Mexican. So I just wanted to share that really quick anecdote. And then also Latinx replacing the universal Latino, as Kat mentioned, is like saying police officer instead of policeman. It's more inclusive. Saying Latinx or Latinx or Latine to a group of Latin people does not exclude Latinos or Latinas, but saying Latinos or Latinas to a group of Latin people does exclude genderqueer, trans, and non-binary folks. Another thing that Kat talked about in that video was hypermasculinity. And a really quick definition here is the extremely or excessively masculine. And so for this slide, I just want to open up an opportunity for you all, again, to react to the video with this particular part of the video in mind, and just unmute or share in the chat a response to any of the three questions. It doesn't matter the order, but what are examples of how hypermasculinity shows up in schools? What are alternatives to that? And how does hypermasculinity impact folks in general? Or how does hypermasculinity impact men, women, and non-binary folks specifically? So you don't have to address them in any particular order, but just anything that speaks to you as a reaction is welcome, and you can unmute or throw it in the chat.
Hi, Jesus. Hi, everybody. Hola, buenos dias. This is Grace Lopez Aliaga talking. I have my video off because the sound is better if my video is off. I just wanted to discuss or bring up the fact that a lot of these pieces, I believe inherently in my soul, don't exist because people necessarily have this desire for hating one another. It's a matter of taboo, really. We don't grow and we don't evolve and we don't become an open-minded, an engaging community that is interdependent on each other instead of codependent on anybody, unless we kind of lead by example. And I think a lot of these pieces that are around inclusiveness and being open and allowing for children and for families to do that introspection are often not seen in leadership. Even when we have those opportunities. I really appreciate what my colleague here from Jeff Coach has brought up, because it makes all the difference in the world when you have the opportunity to see people lead by example. I think that the identification of ourselves, whether we use EKIs or we use any of the other gender programs, is essential. And I know that's just an initial entry point, but safe spaces for kids to school us, like another colleague brought up, right? Teach us, and with real life examples why it's relevant, is probably going to be the best way to go deeper. I appreciate this discussion very much, because I know culturally for many of our families, I want to honor their cultural richness, their faiths, their, all their treasures, but I want them to give opportunity for their children to expand on those, and for them as family members to give room for that to happen. So all of this to say that I agree that we need to create those times and those intentional spaces for introspection in our school system, but we need to do that above and beyond by our actions. Our actions always speak much louder than any of our words, whether they are spoken or written down. So inclusive practices, if it means your name is extra long because you're Latin, Latina, mestiza like me, and you have to hyphenate it and people struggle, it's okay, right? I think the piece around gender identity is not very different from that at all. It just means that they're going to need to provide more space to really be able to address everybody with equity. So thank you for providing this time.
Of course, and thank you for sharing that. I'm just looking at the chat here as well, and Holly shared that example of a teacher asking for a strong person to help move desks, then selects a male student. Janine, you asked about the intersection of faith, and actually Dr. Schepers is going to talk about that in the next slide. And there's a ton of other great examples that you all are elevating here, and we appreciate, we do appreciate it. We're running, I think, maybe 10 or so minutes behind at the moment. And so I'm going to move us on to the next slide if that's okay with you all, but please feel free to drop in additional reactions or reflections that you have. If there's something that is burning inside of you that you want to share with the group, drop it in the chat, please.
Yeah, and I was looking at that comment in the chat as well and thinking this is perfect lead in into our and really what Grace was sharing, perfect lead in into this, like homophobia, transphobia, and really what is it, what are the intersections? And I want to focus on two areas: intersectionality and experiences in K-12 schools as reported by the transgender Latinx folks. And so with intersectionality, as well with all identities, intersectionality plays an important role when it comes to gender inclusive or exclusive practices, right? I wanted to point out that there's this large intersection of Latinidad and religion, and how historically this has driven a lot of hatred of the LGBTQ plus community. And so 68% of, and I put Hispanics in quotes because that's how it was used in the reading, identify as Roman Catholic. And really the Catholic Church position on homosexuality is based on a distinction between being versus acting, right? Like this positionality of it. And then, but often the distinction becomes blurred, and the message that many Catholics hear is that merely the being gay is sinful, right? And so this results in condemnation of LGBTQ Latinxes in communities of faith, and has led some to remain closeted when involved in religious activities, right? So really taking away some of their identity when they're in spaces and not being allowed to be their whole selves. And so as you can see in
in the graph also, and I thought pertinent for us, right? Really thinking about how transgender children who are transgender in K-12 schools experience schools, right? So there's, if you'll notice on the not that I was going to say dark green, but there's like 3 shades of green. Transgender women really experience the most levels of harassment, or but the percentages in general, like the fact that these students are experiencing any kind of verbal, physical, sexual assaults in schools is really, really staggering, and should give us some pause to think about how we can shift that, and whether small or large ways. Any noticings that you all have for that, or any additional comments? I think we'll shift to the next slide, but if you want to pop them in the chat, I'll keep an eye on that.
And I'm going to turn off my camera for just a second and still keep talking to you all, but I need to get to my power cord. So, sorry, bear with me here as I don't want to make you dizzy while I'm moving. But this next slide, situating Latinx in the context of the United States and considering generational shifts, particularly, I think, thinking about our elders. The title of this session is in quotes because it is actually something that we hear often. That folks say things like, "I'm not sure about Latinx." And oftentimes we hear it from people who are descendants of the Latinx diaspora, who identify as Latino or Latina, and particularly in the singular, but who do not seem to mind the masculine version as the universal version. Now, there's a difference between someone who personally identifies as Latino, refusing to identify in the singular as Latinx, because as Kat said, their gender is important to them, and that singular Latino refusing to either be universally inclusive when referring to a mixed group, or if they know someone that has a non-binary identity and misgenders them on purpose. I share that because in my experience, there does seem to be a generational shift, and it is hard to call in a mentor or elder. So if you hear someone say, "I don't know about Latinx," they may not, or they may be Latinx themselves, or they may or may not be one of your mentors. But if you hear someone say that, that is an invitation for an effective ally and co-conspirator to engage in a deeper conversation with someone. I'm putting an emphasis on allies and co-conspirators because it isn't fair for members of the LGBTQIA+ community to always be the responsible parties fighting for equity and equality for themselves, similar to the burden that BIPOC people often carry in challenging white supremacy and racism. We also hear things like, "pero no es español," or that the X is a devaluation of the Spanish language. This argument is incredibly problematic because the agenda becomes clear. It's not that Latinx fails to address any of the problems within Spanish on a meaningful scale. It is that people really do not want any change at all. To change the Spanish language to include others is deemed as a threat to the whole Latinx culture and our identities. This is certainly another symptom of unexamined privilege and internalized colonization. Meanwhile, Spanish colonizers created new words in Spanish for things indigenous to the landmass known as the Americas, right? Like coyote, tecolote, aguacate, camote, cacahuate, chile, jitomate, mezquite, jalapeño, zacate, chocolate, chipotle, tequila, Mexico, Oaxaca, and tons of others. We also hear that the term Latinx is an anglicized word that has been popularized by academia. And we don't necessarily disagree that in the United States, the term has been popularized by academia. But I don't agree with the simplification of labeling it as an anglicized term. it's dismissive. And in our opinion, Latinx is actually a really great example of translanguaging, which is an important practice in bilingual education. And make no mistake about it, trans in this context is the operative term. Trans is a prefix that also comes from Latin and is attached to verb roots that refer to movement or carrying from one place to another. It means across, through, transfer, transmit, transplant. Trans is also used to mean complete change, transform, transmute. And finally, Latinx and multilingual people in the US are in a unique situation because here we say things like white Americans, Black Americans, or African Americans, or Asian Americans, or Latin Americans, Mexican Americans, and so forth. Whereas in Latin America, people's nationality usually comes first as their identification. For example, Mexican. And as I mentioned before, my friends in Miguelausa do not identify as Latino or Latina or Latinx. They identify as Mexicano, Mexicana, or Mexicane or Mexicanex. As I told you that story about the amiguequis, but I didn't mention, I think, that part. Also, additionally, generally speaking, in Latin America, most people are learning Spanish first, which is the case for places like Mexico for the non-Indigenous language-speaking community. We recognize that Spanish does not work that way. That is to seemingly add an arbitrary X at the end of a word. We also hear that English doesn't work that way. But the beautiful thing about places like the United States and the bilingual education community is that we embrace these complex situations and can make language work for our needs through methods like translanguaging, which Latinx is an example of.
Sorry, I was working on putting the link in the chat. So really, and I think this really goes back to the self-identification, right? That is incredibly important, but allowing the space for all to self-identify, right? So the intention is not to misgender by calling someone Latinx when you very clearly know that they are Latino. So I know, you know, that Jesus identifies as Latino, so I wouldn't call him Latinx. So do not impose it on the singular, on people who you perceive to be Latin. Find out what people's preferences and pronouns are first. And that might be as simple as saying, hi, my name is Ofelia Schepers. My pronouns are ella, she, her, hers. If you know their pronouns and you know they identify, then you can say it. If you know a non-binary person's pronouns, they, them, theirs, and you know they identify as Latinx, then you should say Latinx. If you know someone identifies as Chicana, don't impose Latinx on them either, right? So it's in an effort, the use of Latinx is in an effort to be inclusive and not in an effort to exclude people or take people's identities from them and impose your own understanding. So yeah, it's really, I think Kat said this really well, right? We're complex people, and that complexity is beautiful, and it can muddy some of the waters for us when we think about this. And being vulnerable and apologizing when you get it wrong and fixing it, you know, is a really, really initial step of really working on not misgendering.
May I ask a question really quick?
Really quickly, and we may not answer it, but yes.
I just, you know, this notion of not pushing it on other people. I am a first generation American and associate as Mexican American. I've never identified as Latino and don't know enough about Latinx, but that stood out because I have friends who are very passionate about both sides, and they actually turned me off to the term Latinx. and they turn me off to the term Latino because it almost seems like they take a very militant stance. So I'm just wondering, maybe you can't answer it now, but if you guys have some links, or if you all have some links, how to address situations like that. Because I feel at times when some people are very passionate about anything, whether it's Latinx or whether it's pronouns, you could be potentially turning somebody off who is an ally and who wants to be informed, and who no longer will want to be informed solely based off that interaction or how this individual's passion is coming across.
Yeah, I'll try to take a quick stab at it here in our stance, actually, where if we haven't made ourselves clear in the last hour and 5 minutes, we are fans of the term Latinx. For us, again, it doesn't mean that I'm suggesting to you that you should identify as Latin anything. But if you identify as Latino, great. And if there's a woman in your life who identifies as Latina, great. And if there is a mixed group of folks who identify as Latin anything, we recommend using the term Latinx so that it doesn't misgender the women that are in that group. Similarly, we encourage folks to not use anything other than Latinx if you know that somebody identifies in that way. So if somebody doesn't identify as Latin anything, then you shouldn't be calling them Latinx, right? That if you know that somebody identifies as Mexican, for example, then refer to them as Mexican. And so I'm not sure if that answers your question directly, but our stance in advocacy is to use it as a universal term when referring to a mixed group of people, and particularly to singular folks who don't identify with as a man or as a woman specifically. I think for us as allies, we had this conversation about how sometimes we get lazy if it doesn't directly impact us, right? So as I mentioned earlier at the top of the session, my pronouns are él, he, him, his. I'm male presenting, air quotes, whatever that means, but I'm very rarely, if ever, misgendered. And because of that, I don't have to think about it. But because I want to be a good co-conspirator, I make this concerted effort. Like in the Hoover app, I changed my name to include my pronouns, for example. Dr. Schepers mentioned this earlier, but I've been collecting these qualitative data of screenshots of Zoom meetings that I've been in the last year, just to take a really quick stock of who's using them and who isn't. And again, particularly for folks who are rarely, if ever, misgendered, it's something that we don't have to worry about, and it speaks to our privilege. And so one of the things, and I'm looking at the clock here, and we've got 7 minutes. So one of the things that I'll close out here on the stance on is Dr. Schepers and I are part of a collaborative effort with CO-CABE advocacy group, and we're writing a white paper on a position on this. And again, it's not to convince anyone to identify in any particular way. That is, of course, up to each of the individuals. But what we are calling for is for folks to use more inclusive language and to create spaces, as complex as it is, for students to explore their identities in the spaces that you share. Somebody had actually shared this quote by Maya Angelou in the chat earlier, and Dr. Schepers and I were sort of laughing in our text on the side here. But the best thing you can do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. is a quote by Maya Angelou. And so this session was for us to collectively begin to know a little bit better so that we can leave and do a little bit better after this session. Dr. Schepers also posted in the chat this link. You could copy it here. And it's just a Google Doc that we began to curate together for this session specifically. There's a lot of tools there for you all to reference later, articles, books, some additional videos, some of the videos we use from today, and some curricular resources and whatnot. We won't go into that just because we've only got 6 minutes left here. So I just want to share the link with you. Again, it's in the chat, and then we created this bit.ly, so it's pretty easy to find with the Latinx resources as the link there. One of the things that we we also heard folks in the chat talking about other books, other lists that are out there. And of course, we invite you to explore those. We had a question before our session began in the Whova app about how to have these conversations as early as kindergarten. And in there, I shared a quick link to a book called My Princess Boy, I believe, which one of the teachers who I worked with at the school where I was a principal in 3-year-old preschool used with kids. My own son reads Feminist Baby, for example. There's a ton of resources out there that folks can engage in as early as, even before they come to preschool. But that link in the resources is a place where you can find some of them. And of course, it's not exhaustive, and there's tons that we didn't include. Those are just some that we found useful as we were creating the content for this presentation. And again, looking at the time here, we wanted to have a conversation with you all, both on the resources and the advocacy about things that you're doing and things that you're using. But I think because of the time, we won't be able to go too deep into that. But the reality is, in terms of advocacy, you all have already elevated a bunch of the issues, right? So we've got parents who maybe are very religious and homophobic, and there's a conflict between how they interact with their child and how their child maybe wants to interact with you all in schools. And so there's in terms of advocacy, there's ways that you can be an advocate for LGBTQIA+ Latinx students in your own spaces. I was going to share an anecdote about the school where I worked, but again, just looking at the time here, I'm going to move us along to close this out and not abruptly kick you from the Zoom, which will close at exactly 10:30. So these resources are included again in that list. And before we say goodbye to you, we want you to take a quick sec to think about a tangible strategy that you want to use moving forward to advocate for your students and to create spaces for them to explore their identities. How can you be a strong and effective ally or co-conspirator? Feel free to drop some of those into the chat, and if we can maybe get one person to unmute and share aloud, that would be awesome.
Jesus, this is Elena Medina in Denver and at DPS. And I just wanted to say that, it's interesting that you're at a university and you're hearing all of these things that young people are taking on. And I appreciate being pushed to think about equity and standing in unity. And so I'm grateful for the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't want you all to get kicked out with us without us saying goodbye. So before we go, all that I'll just say is this work is not about our comfort level. Sometimes doing what is inclusive is difficult. We are pushing against norms that have been firmly established for many years. And we are pushing against binaries that have served to privilege some while excluding others. The intent, again, is to provide you with an overview of the why this is important, how it has shifted in the space regarding Latinx communities, and hopefully provide you and also generate with you some resources for your own spaces and your own advocacy of students who identify as Latinx. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
For joining us this morning.